newly appointed Curator of Contemporary Architecture at the MoMA, which sounds like a great job and one we want to hear all about. But also because he's from Lisbon, which I don't know if everyone is aware of this, but it's actually Decret's second world city, being home to two of our graduates, Vera Sacchetti and Frederico Duarte, who I believe you probably know because most people do. When he lived in Lisbon, Pedro divided his activity between architecture, teaching, writing, and curating. Pedro is the former editor of Beyond Bookazine and maintains the fantastic blog ShrapnelContemporary. He was a chief curator of the ExperimentaDesign festival between 2001-2003, curated such exhibitions as Metaflux at the 2004 Venice Architecture Biennale, and exhibitions such as Post.Rotterdam, Space Invaders, and Pancho Guedes, an Alternative Modernist. Pedro's first show at MoMA, the collection rotation, he has titled 9+1 Ways of Being Political, 50 Years of Political Stances in Architecture and Urban Design. Sounds like it could be one of a Decret thesis, actually. It was great. This show just opened. And I'm really excited for Pedro to address this question tonight. I hope you are going to do that, right? Okay, good. Because it's one very close to the heart of this program, where we actually teach curating as part of our critical program. So I just want you to get right on with it. Please welcome to the stage Pedro Gadanho.
Thank you. And thank you, Alice, for the invitation to be here today. I had been sort of incognito already for two of these lectures here at the Decret, and it's a favorite of mine, so I was very pleased to come and join the illustrious talkers that have come before me. And so when I was asked to come, the proposition was more or less to accept that sentence that Domus took out of my interview with them, which was the idea that curating is the new criticism. I mean, I'm not so sure about that as it sounded from the title of that interview. That's what media does, takes these, sound bites and just makes them interesting for the audience. But because I tend indeed to question things, then I wanted to come here and question that notion. And so show you a little bit of the work that I did and that brought me to MoMA, trying to explain some of the theses that were beyond projects that I've done. And then at the end, give a sort of a brief mention of the show I just realized in MoMA, so that then we have a motive for discussion related to that recent project. So, this is one of the images I normally use in my conferences, whatever theme I'm talking about, because it's a photograph by Martin Parr. And it's an image I like very much because it really translates for me some of the things I was studying, especially during my PhD, about the idea of consuming architecture. Not only producing, not only mediating, but also the idea of consumption of architecture. Taking the idea that architecture is consumed as a cultural asset, rather than just buildings that are out there and that then also produce some sort of discourse. I do think that architecture is basically a cultural artifact, is a cultural discourse, and is consumed as such, even in moments when people are not realizing that they are consuming architecture. So obviously this image by Martin Parr is quite ironic, because basically it tells us that tourism is many times driven by architecture and cities, and yet people use architecture as sort of a fun background for their activities or for their portraits of themselves or for their, their archiving of their presence in these places. And so for me, this image is quite interesting of the photographer being photographed with the architecture in the background. And this is a collection of images that I've collected over like I don't know, a month of just recently added architectural production onto 2 or 3 sites, 2 or 3 newsletters that I receive every day. It's the way I keep track of what's happening in the architectural world. And I think it's very interesting because it's actually very difficult to identify any kind of trend, any kind of logic, any kind of movement or idealism that was present in the history, apparently, at least from our point of view when we read it historically, that was present in other moments of history. So what I see when I look at contemporary architecture is this mishmash of every possibility that was actually opened up by what we call the postmodern period. The idea that everything is equal in value, the idea that everything is possible. Of course, when we say everything is possible, we're still maintaining, value judgments. We're still form tastes as an important criteria to select these images and not others. I mean, even if I have put as many images as possible, there were still I think there is a problem here. All my images that had text have passed onto white. So now it's only images, which is quite ironic because I was actually talking about the problem of images and the problem that we are more and more consuming architecture through images and not through text. And this is one of the aspects of the crisis of criticism that I see in the current moment, especially in the field of architecture, but maybe also in fields as young as the design fields, because they are very young, or in fields as old as the art world, because the art is subsumed to ideas of the market, and people especially tend not to read so much or to consume longer texts in which critical theses may be exposed and thought about. So basically, what I'm saying is that there is a crisis in criticism in the traditional formats that we were used to consider, especially in its written form, through journals, through magazines, even through newspapers and so on, because people are changing their patterns of reading, their patterns of consumption of information, and therefore are not available to take in, the bigger, wider, more complex arguments about things, and they will only take, in a way, the short version of what is the thinking, the critical thinking about something, the interpretation of something that we're looking at. So basically, in fact, the critics have an important role because they are those interpreters and are those who, in a way, have potentially the ability to transform these more complex arguments that are, let's say, floating around in a specialized circuit. And then they are able or not to process those ideas, to resume those ideas for a larger audience. And this is where I locate curating, and this is where I locate myself. Like some architect, a friend of mine said many years ago, I don't want to preach to the converted. I mean, for me, my function of criticism is to extend the field of architecture, is to open up the field of architecture and to make it understandable and interesting, in a way, for as many people as possible. But at the same time, I try not to lose the idea that my vision or my interpretation has also to be critical, because as it is a filter of what is passing onto a larger audience, it should keep certainly a critical perspective and not just being a total delivery of what people might want to consume in the easiest of ways. So those images, of course, have a genesis. They have a short history behind them in terms of using architecture that has a signature within the context of the contemporary city to produce marketing, to sell, again, other forms of consumption. Forms that, for me, are severely acritical, and that therefore should be addressed. And this is where I think a critic nowadays has to position himself. One of the references or quotes that I had here was actually from Walter Benjamin, and especially from a text that I reread a couple of years ago, and that for me was very important to interpret again on the light of the activity I was taking, curating, which is the author as producer. And in fact, what Benjamin says ultimately in his essay is that the most important aspect for an author is to be able to reflect the condition of production of its time, the conditions of production of its time. And these, obviously, Benjamin being a Marxist, involve social relationships, questions of power, and so on. But basically to situate himself in regards to society and to produce a reflection in regards to what his production is in regards to that society. What kind of effect can it have? What kind of position does it stand for? And therefore, I think this idea of the author is very important, even in terms of curating. We might distinguish authors and interpreters, people who interpret the work of authors. But I do think that recently curating has been, for some reasons, a discipline that has created this notion of the curator as author, in the sense that the way the curator puts interpretation together out of many different elements, out of collections of museums, out of artworks and so on, is itself authorial, is itself a new position, is itself a new form of understanding, juxtaposing these works. So therefore, the curator in a way becomes, for me, an author, and an author specifically in the terms of what Walter Benjamin suggested. These are still images of how architecture, contemporary architecture that stems from the so-called star system nowadays, is still being used to, in a way, sell images of the city, to sell ways of life, and to be part of a larger consumer culture that I think, as a critic, and that's my personal interest, shall we say, is a question of concern and a question that should be addressed. Not only because resources are going to be disappearing very soon. That's a larger catastrophic problem that we tend to, tend to forget, because obviously it's too much for us to handle, and maybe we always see it happening already 1 or 2 generations down, so we don't care too much about it. We have to carry our lives as they go. But certainly there are forms of addressing the problems of consumption and how this consumption has become the rule of the world and is affecting cultural productions that could have other sorts of stances and positions. So obviously this is in fact one of the images, another one of the images I like to use whenever I'm talking about architecture, and that I've actually had the opportunity when coming to MoMA to present in one of its forms in the work of Barbara Kruger. So I was able to bring that work out of MoMA's collection to establish a dialogue in between this work and works by architects. But I'll leave that for the last moments of presentation of the work. And so in between all of this scenario that I'm portraying here, the curious thing is that architects more and more consider themselves sort of away from the decision-making processes. They feel they are not empowered. They feel they have not the power to change the world. And so many times you hear critics and architects talking about the marginalization of the profession. Like if architects had ever had the power to decide on cities, on where cities were going, and so on. But now people feel they want that kind of power. They would like to have that kind of power, and so they're complaining permanently that the profession is marginalized from the center, the where the action is. I think this is false. I think architects have never enjoyed such a good image, such a projection in terms of society, and therefore a growth of the market where they operate. And in fact, they have become more important in terms of the presence they have within this society, just because they help shaping these processes of consumption that I'm discussing here, and they help form the image of the city, and so on and so on. So in any case, one other article I want to reference you, which establishes this reading of Walter Benjamin also in other directions, is an article I wrote for Arquitetura in 2010, which for me was the first moment in which I sort of put forward this thesis that curating would be the new form of criticism, or would be the form of criticism that was more adequate for the way we now consume culture and ideas and thinking and so on and so on, which was the fact that rather than just using the medium of writing, we could now use, I shall call it, a multimedia apparatus, a number of forms, a number of objects, a number of images, films, discourse, whatever, to engage into the practice of criticism. And this is basically the statement, that we as critics, because maybe that's where I'm coming from, as critics, we don't have to just use writing and certain channels that are connected to, you know, the specialized circuit, as I mentioned, or the New York Times section of criticism, and so on, but rather use other means to continue a certain battle, which is to carry out a sort of critical projects in the better sense, in the better modernistic sense, again connected to the idea of Walter Benjamin. And in fact, Walter Benjamin speaks about something that I consider very important in theoretical terms, which is what he called the exhibition value. He has certain writings in which he examines the idea of an exhibition value. What is the value of exhibitions, how exhibitions actually became a very modern media in the 20th century that allow us to reflect and to assort things, to collect things. And he was himself a collector, so obviously the medium of the exhibition was in a way, after the Cabinet of Curiosities, the first art galleries, 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, then suddenly exhibitions become, also after the exhibitions, you know, the grand world exhibitions, 1851 onwards, all these exhibitions had a power of reflecting on society, and he associated a certain value to that. And I think we can explore again that value and try to project into exhibitions and shows and other forms of curating, not only, you know, producing spectacle, but also actually carry these critical messages, critical reflection. And when I think about how criticism can be conveyed through the medium of exhibitions, I actually go back to two critics, two bearded men from the 70s, Rainer Banham and Manfred Tafuri. And I like to put them in a position because they represented two completely different forms of understanding what criticism could be, especially when considering architecture, but in the case of Banham, also design. So Tafuri was the guy who said that operative criticism was something that was unacceptable. And when he said that, he meant that a sort of criticism that was involved with the causes of what it was discussing, it was not possible. You should be totally detached from the objects you were analyzing, and you shouldn't be involved. You shouldn't be an activist when considering. You shouldn't take positions when being a critic. And this, in terms of architecture, has led, for me, that's my interpretation, maybe a little bit, you know, quick as I'm presenting it here, but I think that led onto a whole situation in which there was a demise of criticism in the field of architecture, especially in the United States over the 80s and the 90s, leading to what some call the post-critical moment, in which actually criticism was no longer important, and the important thing was to, you know, produce, and to use production to actually do whatever commentary whatever cultural commentary you had to do on society. So Tafuri was very important because he was a very good critic. He was a very interesting critic, a very strong intellectual, but he left the field of architecture criticism in a sort of limbo. And so what I propose is that we should go back to someone who was just writing slightly earlier than Tafuri, who was Rainer Benham. From the late 50s until the 60s and the 70s, Benham was addressing criticism in a totally opposite way from Tafuri. Rather than intellectualizing things and taking them apart from their context, which Tafuri didn't necessarily do, but rather than doing that kind of attitude, he was really putting objects into the context of the everyday, really reading things in the context of the everyday. And this was very special in terms of criticism because it went, again, a certain academic tradition of, again, as I was saying, intellectualizing the reading of objects. Although he was a beautiful writer, therefore, he had a very strong intellectual power to transform any interpretation he had on objects into such powerful arguments, which is what I think is the power of an intellectual. And so, in fact, Benham presented this sort of immersion in everyday culture rather than this sort of isolation of a critical culture in terms of only academia and in terms of only a certain sect of people who share a certain code of interpretation. And this, I think, is very important, again, when you consider exhibitions again. I mean, if you're talking to an audience which is not only the specialized audience of architects, if I'm not talking to architects alone, if I want to speak to an audience which is larger, I really have to understand how to make the medium I'm working with, either it's writing, like Rainer Benham, or exhibitions, or whatever, I have to understand that this medium has to be really malleable to carry both intellectual arguments of the finest grain and also to be accessible, not to be opaque, not to be really something that people cannot read through. And so this is, for me, very important, and this is where exhibitions, I think, offer, again, a means of transmitting critical ideas in a more transparent way. Well, I shouldn't say transparent because transparency, it's a question that is very complicated, as I myself put forward in the show at MoMA, but I would say that at least it allows for people to understand things in their own terms. That is, in terms of the languages, the visual languages, namely, that they're used to consume on an everyday basis. Television, films, discourses on the radio, and so on, newspapers. A culture that people, or internet, or so on, the culture that people are immersed in, and that actually has common features with the medium or the format of exhibitions. There is a lot of text here that has just gone astray, so this is a total improvisation on the images I have here, but I think it's better that way. As I was saying, I myself was first an architect. I studied as an architect, and then I always felt the need to produce interpretation, criticism, and so on. And so I became part of a generation that, curiously, in Portugal, maybe because it has had a strong architectural identity through the 70s and 80s, has produced a generation of architects critics. People that are not coming from the academic tradition, from art history, but that are coming from practice and are actually using their practice to also produce criticism. People who write and do architecture, which allows you, in a way, to be more hands-on and more connected to the way things are done, rather than the detached position, again, of the intellectual that reads things from a theoretical, historical point of view. So it's more connected, it's probably more pragmatic, less intellectually committed to grand theories, but has that quality of being connected to the action. And so, as such, I've been doing architecture, I've been doing criticism wherever I could find the opportunity, and I started curating shows. And those are the ones I'm going to present very quickly, just as a sort of overview, so that you then may discuss with me if they carry or not a critical position and some sort of criticism. I'm going to try to make that argument, and then you're going to tell me if you think I was successful or not. So the first show I've ever did, and I must say that all of these activities came along because actually I couldn't survive as only doing architecture in terms of financial, monetary terms. And this was typical also of that generation, and that's why they were critics and curators and architects, and these will, I believe, will be most typical of the next generation, because people won't survive of one activity only, and so they will diversify their possibilities so as to be able to purely survive. And so the first show I did was taking the opportunity of a certain moment in which Porto was the European capital of culture, together with Rotterdam, and I was teaching in Porto, I had studied in Porto, I was practicing in Porto. There's a strong, I think, conservative school of architecture there, and I wanted to confront that school with a production that, although it was known by students, it was not so present in terms of discourse and in terms of debate. And therefore, I took the opportunity of looking at something that by the late 90s was really the hype in terms of international architecture, which was Dutch architecture. With Ram Koolhaas, MVRDV, there was a whole generation of architects actually coming from Rotterdam that made Dutch architecture recognizable all around the world. The show was produced in 2001, and for me, actually, it was a sort of an end of a cycle show. It was not like just showing the work of these fantastic architects that have beautiful work that I loved. It was rather a sort of critique and analysis of what was the hype that Dutch architecture had produced, and where did it go, what did it meant, what kind of results would it have. So in fact, apart from showing the work of people like Ram Koolhaas and MVRDV, but also Knox, which were into parametric or digital architecture, if you want to call it that way, and many other architects from Rotterdam, under the presupposition that because Rotterdam had been bombed during the Second World War, it had become a sort of laboratory for a new form of architecture, because they were disconnected, severed from history, and therefore they were able to free themselves from certain historical aspects of architecture production, like we see still today in Italy, for instance, in which the weight of history is so big that architects actually feel trapped and cannot produce innovation in certain terms because they are trapped by their own architectural history. Here, the thesis was that it was the bombing of Rotterdam that allowed for this kind of architecture to come through. But, as I was saying, this was not only a show of wealth, of capacity, of intellectual strength, but it was also a critique of what this could lead into. And so for that, of course, I used not only my own perceptions, but also I invited critics to contribute articles towards the catalog, in which I expressly asked them to produce critical visions of what was happening. And so actually there was maybe a schizophrenia, which I think is interesting anyway, an ambivalence in terms of the show that is spectacular, that is in a way attractive for a larger audience, and then if you dig in, a critical subtext that actually questioned what was in show. And this is the kind of strategy that I was using and I am probably using, and one that I think I find most interesting. And then there are those who are able to read them, these strategies, or not. And these here, I'm using another theoretical concept introduced by Umberto Eco in the open work, which says that the reader reads as much information as the cultural luggage he or she has. So that means that if you're very cultured in Dutch architecture, you go and see this show and you read a certain subtext. If you know nothing, you read another subtext. But you read something. And everybody reads something, but some read more than others. And this is where I think, again, the meaning of the medium of exhibitions is interesting as the writing medium in allowing for those kinds of layerings into the discourse. For me, it was much more interesting the next show I was organizing, which was actually like 6 months later. I always say as a joke that my first year as a curator, because I didn't have any sort of education in terms of curating. I just wanted to do an exhibition, and then I did another, and then another. And the first year I did 2, probably the biggest budgets I have ever did, so it was like going down after that. So this year, 2001, it was 2 shows, one in April, one in September. And in September actually was the show that I consider more interesting in terms of content, because rather than retrospectively looking at a certain production, it was trying to understand what was coming, what was emerging. And this is where I find the work of curating is especially connected with trend watching, if you want to call it that way, which is actually trying to understand where things are going and trying to anticipate what is happening and trying to read signs of what might be happening in terms of currents of thoughts, currents of thinking, currents of practicing, and so on. And so here, the thesis for this show, called Space Invaders, done for the British Council in 2001, the thesis here was, again, very connected to the urban, was the idea that actually it was the atmosphere of the metropolis that produced a diverse architecture. This sort of, many different ways of approaching architecture in the same time, at the same moment. This was something that was allowed by the atmosphere, by the nature of a big metropolis. And this was certainly connected with sociological thinking of Georg Simmel in the beginning of the 20th century, in which he was actually talking about the influence of the metropolis in the psychology of people. And I think, again, we are facing another situation in which megalopolis, that is, cities that are bigger than 10, 12 million people, actually produce a certain kind of atmosphere which is no longer connected to national identity and other kinds of themes that were very typical of the 19th and even the 20th century. And they produce a different mentality and therefore also a different kind of practice. So the city here was London, and the fact that London is so multiracial, multicultural, actually produced a number of practices that were very different in nature, but in a way that revealed the condition of their time. Again, in terms of interdisciplinary practices that connected art and design with architecture, and a sort of aformalism, which was not connected to certain language experiences or certain tendencies, but were open to experiment with whatever materials and transgressions were available. And so for me, this show was more revealing than the previous one, because in a way, it was trying to look forward and to try to make arguments in regards to future scenarios. This is a show I consider very relevant as well, although I must say it was very, I have to hurry up maybe. I should keep on the 40 minutes. If not, I have to hurry up. If not, I'll take it easy, as I was doing it. This exhibition is very small, but for me, very impactful in terms of the way exhibitions actually can have an effect on reality. So that was in Lisbon by the time of ExperimentaDesign number 3, 2003. There was in Lisbon the plan to build several parks, vertical parks in the city, within the historical city. And what the mayor wanted to do, or the projects that were ready to be built, were actually these sort of pastiche projects in which you would maintain the facade of an old building and just build a parking garage beneath that facade. And we thought this was terrible. And because we were actually connected to the mayor, because the mayor was supporting Experimenta, we were very open in our criticism of this process, and we decided to initiate a parallel process by calling ideas and to have young architects, to invite young architects presenting ideas for car parks, which would be innovative in nature and which would be actually adapted to the condition of the contemporary city. So curating here becomes a curating that is connected to a call out for ideas, but also is connected to actually do buildings in the city. Rather than representing architecture, which is one of the typical problems of curating architecture, which is how do you represent something only through its representations and not through the real thing. Here, the idea was actually to commission and make buildings in the city, and therefore affect the life of the city by producing, by curating these choices, by selecting work, by conducting the way the work should be done, and then try to produce them in the city. Of course, we were young and naive, and although the process was successful, and the city actually stopped the initial plans they had for the car parks, they never realized, and they started negotiating to build some of these car parks. Then the bureaucracy came in, and none of these car parks was actually built. But it was, well, let's say that the closest I got to, or we got to that moment in which you can actually curate in the city, in the public space, rather than just in paper or in an exhibition space and so on. Actually, that will come back in the last exhibition I'm presenting. So again, the modus of exhibition, the mode of exhibition, as you will see, all the strategy of the presentation of the Biennale during this year was like a truck that was traveling across Europe that would park in public spaces and therefore would be in your face towards people that were not connected to design culture or architecture culture. So people were actually looking at these models, trying to make out what they were, trying to understand, and probably being confronted for the first time in their lives with what we call contemporary architecture, at least in the way we see it normally in its representations within the field. And of course, the experiences were exhilarating because they were really radical in terms of their conception. And this was, again, part of the amazing process of curating these ideas, because they actually originated new content, things that weren't there before, that weren't just being collected, but were being originated through the process of curating. Metaflux was the national representation, Portuguese representation to the Venice Biennale. And it was simply taking an opportunity in which some young curators, me and a colleague, had realized that the Venice Biennale wasn't as important in Portugal, wasn't as considered, so we managed to go through the bureaucratic meanders and make ourselves the curators of the show, and actually have the only show in the last 10 years which actually showed young architects, young Portuguese architects, of which there are so many. And this was the only moment in which these were shown in Venice. Apart from this show, it was always the same old names, classical masters, Eduardo Sotomora, Assis, and so on, because institutional culture takes hold of these things, and very easily the critical edge is lost in by just wanting to represent whatever is established and whatever is recognized as having a value that is representative. So, of course, for sometimes, and this is my first take on the, entering the institutional sphere and trying to produce still this kind of criticism through the media of exhibition, I think is particularly difficult, because all these projects were self-initiated, let's say, as a freelance agent. And it's more difficult when you're trying to represent different interests to actually keep that critical edge. But I think it's important to have both, to have the established and the institutional, and also those who act from the margins or from the places where you can actually subvert the order that exists in a certain field. So the thesis here was to show that there were two younger generations emerging that reflected, again, a cosmopolitan nature and a change of identity in Europe at that time, 2004, still going on. But also it used the work of artists to comment on the same urban realities that were actually being addressed by the architects. So you had architects intervening with their younger projects, self-representing their work, but on the side you had the work of artists that were actually looking at the urban development, at situations in the city. And so this was for me a continuation of certain projects I had done already and which continues up till today, which is to use the notion of conflation, to conflate different discourses and then to see by this sort of sometimes surrealistic juxtaposition to see what comes out of that conflation, of that conflict. Because that kind of conflict can originate by itself debate, can originate new ideas. So I'm always very interested, and the exhibition at MoMA is again a proof of that, and also a privileged one because I'm able to access work of art which is truly amazing. I think that this dialogue in between contemporary art and architecture is essential to produce that sort of chemistry, that chemical reaction that originates also critical interpretation. Pancho Guedes was the only show I did in my life about actually an author, the so-called monograph, which is the theme, the perfect theme of so many curators, especially when we're considering the masters of modernism and so on. And this was the only time, and I must say, I don't want to do any more of those, but it was still interesting, or interestingly, it was still an attempt to represent a sort of an alternative history and to use a figure that was acting in Mozambique during the 50s to actually reveal something that was lying undiscovered, which was an alternative view of modernism, which was much more connected to very organic architecture and a very something that was very connected to the vernacular, to the popular culture, which was happening in Africa for a specific reason, because it was far from the centers of production where modernism was dominating, and because the conditions were so different that people actually found that modernism had its flaws and couldn't relate to that sort of context. So actually some of the first critiques of modernism in terms of architecture come from South Africa, from the ex-students and ex-collaborators of Corbusier, who studied this school in Johannesburg and started to question the possibility of modernism becoming a global international language. And actually, Pancho Guedes was a student in that school, and then he went back to Mozambique, which was Portuguese at the time. And again, because he was far away from the center, from also the Portuguese administrative center, he was free to explore whatever he wanted. And he explored the surrealistic vein. He was a modernist that was exploring that surrealistic vein that comes from Dali and from Art Nouveau that was left unexplored by the hegemony or by the domination of the more abstract vein of modernism. So what I was trying to show here was that there was an alternative history of modernism occurring at the same time as modernism gained its sort of, its sort of presence around the world. This is another exhibition done for the Portuguese Architectural Guild. And the only reason it's here, it's because I want to tell a story, a sort of private joke, which is not very well known, but I think I can tell it here. I'm very far away from home. Which is the pleasure here was actually to have an exhibition that was just a national exhibition, a sort of commission by committee, an exhibition by committee, to select work that had been done over the last years, transform it into a curatorial project subversively. And then being able, and this would only be possible in Portugal because people are not really, looking through your work, they're not actually checking what you're doing, what you're writing, and so on, and suddenly everything is done and they realize what happened. And so actually it was a very subversive process because it was very institutional, but I first established a sort of ground in which I wanted to work, which was curatorial rather than by committee. And these altered completely the kind of choices that were made. And then the text, again, in the catalog, was asking these 7 critics to actually produce, the most realistic as possible critiques of the contemporary situation, which obviously wasn't very pleasing to the Architects Guild, which always wants to project a positive image of architects in society and someone who is actually only doing good things for the wealth of society and so on. So having a critical vision emanating from the institution itself was obviously devastating. I don't know why, because I think when you're self-critical, it's probably when you achieve in a better way or in a more interesting way actually to achieve that sort of communication to society that the Guild should be aiming at. But in any case, there was obviously a shock. And the reason I have the book here was that, again, the book, or the catalog, if you want to call it that way, was an essential part of carrying the most critical aspect of the show. And so there is still the writing underneath this activity of curating as a sort of something that is always at the center, and that is the way to produce reflection. So I'm not saying by saying that curating is the new criticism that we should totally forget about writing and entering a critical discourse in writing. On the opposite, it's just to introduce or mix that kind of tool within other sets of tools, and therefore being able to carry the message through in a more effective way. So actually for me the catalogs have been always essential because shows are ephemeral, shows disappear, shows have a very limited impact in time. Some of them remain historically important, but this is a fraction of all the shows that are produced, and therefore the catalogs are the only thing that actually carries into history a certain argument and a certain set of ideas. So that brings me to another curatorial project which is totally different in nature, which is not about doing exhibitions, but it's actually using the medium of writing. So for me, this project, Beyond the Magazine, was actually a curatorial project. It was not an editorial project. I don't consider myself an editor at all. Here, what I was doing was selecting people. Therefore, working as an art curator or an architect curator, we're selecting some artists or architects that he or she thinks represent certain ideas or certain possibilities. So I was selecting writers and commissioning them with new work that would defend a certain thesis. That is, that even writing had to change in formats and content so as to reach different audiences. And here enters the notion of fiction. The fact that fiction is not just about telling stories, not just about the true and false. Fiction is actually a language, a tool, a device to actually produce ideas. And it doesn't matter what kind of format it uses. I mean, we've seen a sort of an emergence of architectural fiction recently, but also in the 70s. There is design fiction. If you want to see Dune and Rabi, for instance, they're using the concept of design fiction. So fiction is like a larger tool. It's like a system that you can use, and it is a certain technique that you can use to produce other forms of writing rather than the typical academical forms of writing. So what I was defending here was that we have to find other ways of writing that are more playful, that are more accessible, and that carry ideas not in these very, I would say, stale formats of the academia. I know I'm in the academia, but I think it's important to say these things because it's from the academia, obviously, that people will get the education to be able to change these formats and to go beyond the sort of limitations that we can find in a sort of academic paper. So actually, I was defending here, again, as a curator, that there were possibilities of to present thinking about architecture with other means, with other kinds of languages, rather than the ones we were using over the last decades. So obviously, like, I was inviting people like Bruce Sterling to write architectural fictions. Actually, he introduced these terms, and he was using it already. Some years ago, he was writing architectural fictions because he was using architecture and scenarios of architecture as the main part, as a character of his stories. So he talks about design fictions and architectural fictions already for a while. And also, like architects, we use means like a cartoon to actually express ideas, critical ideas, in fact, about their work or works that they had been commissioned, like in the case of, what's his name? Wes Jones, he was commissioned to do a project for Dubai, and then he refused to do it on ideological grounds, and then he wrote an history to say what would be the perfect building to respond to the condition of Dubai. And so he produced this fictional building, this fictional story in which the building is totally explained in terms of its sustainability, but it's a total dystopia. I mean, the most perfect building to solve the situation is also obviously a technical and social dystopia, which actually, you know, keeps the social inequalities in place, that sort of even brings them to the fore, which would be what most buildings done by star architects in that context would be doing. Again, just allowing for the consumption of land, of vistas, and so on and so on. So again, this is carrying critical messages through formats that are apparently innocuous. And I think this is important because I think in order to be critical today, you have to be really smart. You have to really know how to pass messages, to actually address audiences with messages that are, you know, playful, ironic, but that certainly pass some kind of information that is not being passed otherwise. So I think it's a very tricky business, and it's very difficult to perform, at least in this kind of condition that I'm talking about, which is included in a vast panorama of possibilities as ever. So these were obviously themes also chosen for their relevance in terms of what is happening now. Values and symptoms, trends and fads, this thing that architects consider themselves immune to, but that in fact totally affects the way they produce work because it's all about taste culture. So these questions, in a way, have to be addressed, and that's why I consider the project curatorial rather than editorial, because it's a critical project. So these led on to other experiences like a conference on architecture and fiction that actually revealed that there are many people thinking about these questions, and to the sort of sustained activity of the blog that kind of stopped as soon as I started my 9-to-5 job. But in any case, I just wanted to, you know, refer to all these questions again as possibilities of, you know, anticipating the future or reading the past critically. And I think these would be the most important functions of a curator as a critic, or of a critic as a curator. And so this brings us to questions that are worrying me, which lead to my unrealized projects that I will try to realize someday, which are connected actually to what I think are the biggest problems in our midst at this very moment, which is the amazing growth of cities, the amazing growth of the population, and what's going to happen in 30 years. Especially considering that 1/3 of the population of the world, if not more, I'm not aware of it now, most of these people will be poor. Therefore, the kind of solutions that we are envisaging as designers and architects, most of them are totally useless within the next 20 to 30 years. Except if you consider some ghettos in some places. So I think these are the questions that we should be addressing, and of course there are risks in addressing those questions, of making the idea of the slum and of poverty a sort of spectacle in itself. And so therefore you must really be very careful when addressing problems like these, because they are very real, but at the same time they are very politically, or drive us to sometimes very politically incorrect questions. And so we arrive in the present moment and what I was doing this year. At the same time I was preparing the exhibition at MoMA, I was again curating the city, let's say. Again, another capital of culture, which means that state-funded culture in Europe is still what produces whatever we consume as culture coming out of Europe. So although this is being destroyed right now at the moment we're speaking, culture in Europe by tradition is still supported by the state, at least partially, and it's there that things are still happening. It's there that you still have opportunities to actually produce new thinking, new objects, and so on and so on. And this was the opportunity again in the European Capital of Culture of this year to produce an exhibition that explored this idea that I've been writing about for like 5 years. So it's like a continued project, which is the idea of performance architecture, or the idea that architecture is suffering its performative turn, which is that performance, or the idea of performance and performativity, is becoming more important than previous narratives such as functionality or so on and so on, which also means that maybe the user is coming back in a new guise, and there's something that really activates architecture. And so this was again a commission, curating a competition, in which people were asked to present ideas for the city, which were built along these months in public space. Just to give you an example, this was proposed by a group of young architects in Porto, and they called it Fountain Hacks. And the idea made quite a lot of sense because the city is very institutional again, it's very historical, has lots of fountains because these are representative of public space in a very historical tradition. And therefore they proposed, just by buying material for swimming pools and the beach and so on, to transform the fountains into swimming pools. And so to originate a kind of appropriation or hacking of existing spaces with another function that actually lived off people sort of taking over the city. And I think this is a revealing project in our current moments and also explains what I understand by performance architecture. And so you'll understand by all of my discourse that there is a sort of political overtone, which is not necessarily partisan or ideological, but there is certainly a feeling that we are entitled to be political, and to be political in as many forms as we can envisage. To be political in forms that are not even considered political sometimes, but to use, especially if we are acting in the cultural field, to use notions of the political which have to do with these ideas. Let's call it positive subversion, working from within the system to bring out ideas that are not being discussed or shown, and so as to, in a way, produce also, like in the exhibition at MoMA, this section about iconoclasm and institutional critique. How can architects actually produce institutional critique? How can they be iconoclasts if they're being commissioned to produce buildings? How are they going to bite the end that is giving them the money to actually produce those buildings? This is a very important question, because I still think that architects, although being commissioned to build these buildings and to obviously having to respond to functional needs and so on, they still have to carry a cultural message within those buildings. And this cultural message should be, because we are still the ones who have the intellectual power to do so, should have this critical edge of actually commenting on what's happening in several aspects and dimensions of society. So this is what the show is about, just showing from the collection of MoMA that actually we have been political since immemorial times, especially because polis, or political, is connected in terms of its genesis as a word to the word polis, city in Greek. And therefore, we are always, when dealing with the polis, are necessarily being political. And this is the thesis. So it shows artists, designers, architects actually responding to the cultural condition of the city with ideas, with discourses, with buildings sometimes, with objects, with whatever is at hand to produce that kind of critical commentary. I'm open to questions about this show, so we can continue now the discussion around these, or some other topics.
Thanks, Pedro. That was great. Yeah, the way we do it is, I didn't explain this actually to you yet. But I'll keep that. No, I'll kick it off with a couple of questions, but our first year students are actually graded on the questions that they ask in these scenarios, so I'll help you pick them out before we open it up to the rest of the gang. So that was fascinating. Thank you for taking us on that journey. I wonder if I'd just like to ask a couple of questions to start. I would like to know a little bit more actually about the kind of real nuts and bolts of curating, and what are some of the equivalents, if there are equivalents, to the literary techniques we might use in criticism, like rhetoric or language, vocabulary, these things that you use in curating to convey that critical position. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, there is certainly elements in common, like the editing in the sense of taking out what is not essential, what is not important, and the way you construct an argument from with a beginning, a middle, and then an ending, what kind of effects you want to use or produce in certain moments of an exhibition. So yes, I would say that there are analogies to the way you produce a text, to the way you use literary technique. But apart from that, I would say that because precisely it's multimedia, that means it can use an array of media that goes from film to images to text to objects to whatever. Of course, it can also draw from, if you want, movie culture or movie techniques and so on. And we've seen exhibitions like that. Not that I'm particularly interested in that field, but you've seen exhibitions around the world that use cinematic techniques. But I think, again, editing, it's probably the notion that is central in that respect. And the fact that you're being critical or not, which is not imperative, of course, I just think, I want to do it like that, but it's not imperative. You can do it in many different ways, again. The editing, by selecting, you're always being critical already. That's one of the bases of criterion, of selecting, of establishing what has value or doesn't have value. And we have that kind of rule. With whatever you leave out, for instance, of an exhibition, you're already making a commentary on what you don't think is too relevant or important. It's interesting in the process of MoMA, because when you're looking at a collection, and I think most critics that read the exhibition haven't actually understood that point. When you're looking at a collection, I mean, you have to work with the work that is in the collection. So you have to edit a large swath of material. It becomes just a selection of, in this case, like 100 works, which is a lot. But you're selecting out of maybe 2,000, 3,000 works. So whatever I left out is already absolutely revealing. And then, of course, I didn't have the option, because it's only collection-based, to have some things that people would consider relevant, which I could not use, obviously, because they were not in the collection.
I just wanted you to speak some more about dealing with a collection, because this must have been pretty, this is a new thing for you, right? You've been working in these temporary spaces, doing these amazing exhibitions, but very much in kind of interstitial spaces, working thematically with in a kind of very temporary way. So what are some of the benefits of working with the collection that you're now with, and some of the challenges? Yeah.
Well, as soon as I started to understand what the position was all about, in fact, the collection became the central issue, because it was new for me, because it was a challenge, because it has a vast potential. I mean, for me, the key notion of the show, of this first show, is also, in a way, to reveal that this material can be rearranged in any form we want. And so there is a lot of interpretation involved, and there is also this question, which I think is very important from a critical point of view, is in regards to history, which is to be able to read history permanently from the point of view of the present. So not to be representing points of view of how history was read in 1851, but trying to read what was happening in 1851 with fresh eyes of 2010. or 2012. So the question is, as we change, as we move along, as new themes come onto our radars, of course, reading history becomes always totally different. And this is what I find fascinating. And so a collection is like a bit of history. It's like a representation of history. It's not, for me, never will be the best representation of history possible, because there will always be things that are lacking, that are not as representative as one would like. And it is limited, even if it has actually 30,000 pieces with the Venice archive and so on. Even if it has 30,000 pieces, it is still limited. And so for me, immediately the challenge and the interesting aspect was to consider that what I'm doing here is actually continuing a work that has been done by many before me of constructing this collection. And the way I construct this collection is what will allow, hopefully also, for new interpretations in the future, because I'm trying to open up fields that were not represented in the collection. And this is very obvious in the show, because there is a whole section, one of the last ones, occupying social borders, in which actually the works have been acquired all over the last 1 year. So one or two before me and the others by me, which means already that, and this is one of the questions I had for Barry Bergdahl, as soon as he mentioned that I could do the first show only 9 months after I was starting at MoMA, which was, can I do acquisitions until September? Because that was essential for me to complete, at least in certain areas, what I wanted to represent as this array of possibilities of being political.
So do you think you'll be going through, you're basing your acquisition choices, because that's what I wanted to ask you about next, by show? It'll be governed by the theme of your shows, or do you have kind of just like a shopping list that you've got?
No, I don't have a shopping list, that's for sure. What I have is the perception of things that come into my radar that I think are relevant or not, and then I go along and I just take decisions. There are things I know I want to have there that are not there, which are already, so in a kind of way are part of a shopping list, but it's not like exactly that. And I try to balance, when I'm having the idea of my next show, I try to balance acquiring 2 or 3 pieces that will feature in that show as new acquisitions, and other things that are ongoing. Because this is a long process. I mean, in MoMA, as you can imagine, everything takes a while, because it's a large machine, it's a very perfect and fine-tuned machine that, because it is as such, has its time to produce everything. So it's very different from the sort of activity you can lead when being a freelance and just go with the flow very quickly and just paying attention to this or that. So it takes its time. And therefore, even the acquisitions processes are long, and they take quite a sort of collegial process of discussion and understanding of the value of the pieces in terms of their presence in the collection.
What's your most ambitious acquisition that you've got now?
That's part of the business. Secrecy. Confidential.
All right, let's open it up for questions from university students. Yes, now.
Yes, you mentioned the diversifying design profession. I wanted to ask, how don't you think that it's created a loss in identity of such professions in design, especially nowadays where it's really hard to distinguish between design and art, and now it's different fields of design. So what's your point of view about that?
I don't think it represents a lack of or a loss of identity. I am all for all possible mixes and all possible minglings, and I think out of that is what our culture, our contemporary culture actually is coming out. I mean, in the modern period, and I'm not taking the modern period as only the 20th century, was precisely characterized by dividing things into disciplines, into fields of knowledge, and to compartment things and produce specialization. And I think finally, we are now in the situation of reverting that process and again consider everything as possibly mixed. So I think people find their own identity personally, individually, or collectively in groups. And therefore, that's where I think people find their strength again. I don't believe in these narratives of identity, of it's like nationality, representing nationality. For me, I think this is really a thing of the 19th century that continued well into the 20th century. But I think we can start questioning those things. And I think the cultural field, again, will be the first to question artists and architects and so on by their global trade, by the way they infiltrate different situations and they travel freely. They are maybe the first ones to anticipate a sort of world in which national boundaries are no longer important, which I think is what is driven still politics and politicians. But I think the cultural field has that capacity and a mission of actually showing where things are going in certain respects, and I think that's why it's important.
Could you elaborate more? You spoke about positive subversion, and here you are part of MoMA now, which is sort of the height of the canon. How can you be subversive at MoMA? And
well,
can you be subversively subversive?
Well, you have to tell me. I mean, you have to go and see the show and understand if it managed to be subversive or not, because there are certainly intentions of producing certain aspects of subversive discourse there. And if you read the texts in the wall, they are actually in some moments very critical of the contemporary activity of architects, which is not typical or expected of a museum of MoMA's stature. So I think I'm, in a way, profiting from a situation in which contemporary art already opened the way into representing subversive thinking in the realm of a museum. It's like a free zone in actually you can present thinking that would be considered too radical and would probably lead you into prison if you were manifesting it outside with other people in Wall Street. But in the context of the museum, you still have that sort of freedom in actually you can present these radical ideas. Maybe because people think that people are just going there and consuming that as a sort of a spectacle and not really understanding the true message of what artists are saying. But I think there are large parts of the audience that actually capture those messages and are led to reflection by those messages. So again, I would say that I take a lot of advantage from my knowledge of art curating because I was very connected to the art world, to the contemporary art world in Portugal and in general. And so for me, it's a model that I'm using, that I'm referring to when I come into the field of architecture or design, if you want. Because I do think that in terms of architecture, sometimes architecture in terms of reflection is lagging behind the world of art. Like sometimes 30 years, sometimes 2 years, but it's lagging behind. And it's only taking in things that are coming from the art world very slowly, very slowly because it's a slow media. And so actually, I think it's very important to learn from other practices and again, to mix those different practices and learn from other practices so that we can import what is potentially the best tools you can use for your own trade.
What's your idea about the relationship between architecture and photography?
Well, I think it's fascinating. It's one of my favorite themes. So it's like, I think especially because of this importance that the image has acquired, as the visual culture has acquired over the last years. And by the way, I was just collecting information for another panel I'm participating in 3 weeks. Which is an ambitious discussion about the state of the world. And I just got this tweet that said that 10% of all the images that have been produced in man's history have been produced in 2011. Okay, this is totally amazing. And this is very important. This means that we are totally immersing and being submerged happily into the world of images and consumption by images and so on, which is a reality. I don't want to be moralistic about it, like many people are, in fact. I don't want to be moralistic about it. I want to analyze it as a phenomena. And there, photography and the way photography has looked onto architecture and the city, I think it really gives very interesting clues on how we can, again, subvert some traditional readings that are coming from the interior of the field of architecture. So I look at the relationship between architecture and photography as one that is very fertile. That will lead us to understand a lot, because it's using actually the tools of the field of photography, the capacity to analyze an image, to actually then use it as a critical tool towards architecture. So it's using another set of tools, let's say, to read what you would normally use with more historical disciplinary tools that are coming from architecture's history or tradition. So I think, again, this contamination is very useful.
Speaking of photographs, I'm actually wondering what you acquire when you acquire architecture for the museum. Is that documentation, models, blueprints? I mean, what exactly are your acquisitions?
Well, there are different moments, different interpretations of what you should collect. I myself am trying to introduce my own perspective on that, which would be that if you want to represent a certain work of architecture, you have to have a cluster of means of representation that can include photographs, drawings by the author, that can include a model, that can include a video, things that actually portray several aspects of the work. I must say that the tradition up till now in most museums was actually to find the piece that had aesthetical relevance, either a drawing or a model, and just have that one piece as representing a whole work. I think we need more to represent actually a work. So what I'm suggesting is that for each work we acquire the work in terms of its, let's say, of the projects, but we acquire it through a number of pieces that represent as many aspects as possible, represent the way that typically the architects represent themselves, the kind of graphic representations or whatever that they use. So there will be one architect that I want to represent with drawings and drawings. There will be another architect or another project I want to represent through a model and a video, because I think those tools are actually more representative. And you'll see in these acquisitions I've made recently, you see these different arrays. In the case of Caesar, of course, the sketches are the most important part of the explanatory process of creation. So the sketches are there, and then you have probably one model. But in the case of another author, it could be a photograph, which is done as an author limited edition that actually represents the project from the point of view of that author. And the other ones, there are videos that they made to represent. Normally they do, like Rommel Bohr, they normally do a video that they present in conferences to sort of explain the process of the...
I was interested in what you're talking about with your Metaflux show, this dialogue between...
Metaflux?
Metaflux, yeah, the contemporary art and architecture. And I'm just wondering sort of how you facilitate the discourse when you have the pieces next to each other. Like, how do you, rather than just selecting them, how do you get them to communicate with each other? How does that discourse happen? Or how do you hope that it happens?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't know. No, the question is, I think this is again where the luggage, the cultural luggage or baggage of the viewer comes into place. Because you're expecting for people to understand what this work means and what this work means, and then to create their own interpretations. And I think this is important because we sometimes look at the viewer or the audience as being passive, and I think they are active. In that, I totally respect the way Roland Barthes wrote about, reading and audiences and so on. So for me, the audience is active and should be considered as such. So what I do is, I know I have an interpretation, so I try to display it as best as possible, sometimes just with a very deadpan juxtaposition, and then I expect people to either understand that interpretation or build their own interpretation, which for me is equally fine. But of course, you use captions to explain certain things. You select materials that can relate or try to establish that kind of chemistry. So you use qualities that you know from your perception of visual language in a three-dimensional space using different materials. By the way, just to complete these, when I was doing which was my first show, when I was doing the Post.Rotterdam show, I thought that for people to understand what was going on when they saw these models of projects, I had to have, rather than text explaining that, I had to have interviews with the architects, and they would explain in their own words what had happened during the process, what were the ideas in play, and so on and so on. So these interviews were engendered so as to produce a sort of layman's discourse in common words in which people are just explaining a project. And this proves very effective because then people were not reading some sort of abstract text, which is always constructed, but they were just listening to a very common, banal discourse, although it was obviously informed by the knowledge these people had of their own projects. But in fact, that proves very effective in terms of communicating what models certainly could not communicate.
Probably draw it close there. Now there are layers of multiple meaning in our cheese plate next door, so I invite you to come next door and discover those. But before we do, please join me in thanking the wonderful Pedro Gadanho.